Hey, hello, it's Friday. You know the drill. If you don't know the drill is pretty self-explanatory. We're going to talk about a book. Today, that book is The Foxglove King by Hannah Whitten. No surprise, it was on the thumbnail. And I honestly don't know if my thoughts on this are going to be unpopular or not. Not that they're as intense or strong as that sentence implies, but let's jump into them. Go ahead and comment as you feel moved throughout any of this, but if you are looking for a kind of mix, a mashup, if you will, of Serpent and Dove and The Cruel Prince, you just can't decide between the two, this book is why choose? We follow our protagonist Lore, who is basically a spy and a poison runner. And at the beginning of the book, she is still kind of on a job where she has kind of infiltrated the circle of this other poison runner. And I will say that the beginning of this book is incredibly active. I thought that the start here was a really great introduction to the world, especially the way it was using poison as kind of a drug and how it impacted the world itself. And so then Lore is pulled in to basically a job with her primary group that includes her mothers. And we find out a little bit about her mysterious past through this, in that she had been found as a child kind of wandering these catacombs under the city. And there is a lot of religious significance within this world to that. We do have this world of dead gods, basically. Very similar in some ways to Divine Rivals in terms of how I'm thinking or was reading about the gods interacting with the world, just in my own recent reading experience. And so she's on this job, and through this she has a run-in, or the runner that she is basically going to pick up a drop from has a run-in with the city guards, and it does not go well, and it leads Lore to using some of her power, which basically causes her to turn a horse into a zombie. She has these powers to kind of manipulate death. And these powers are a little tenuous at first in terms of us, or at least me, and that may just be my own comprehension skills understanding them as a reader, but she has this power to manipulate this life force and death. And the whole reason poison is so coveted by people in this world is that it can potentially slightly extend a lifespan. And so there is this really interesting relationship with death and excess even in this world. And that's definitely the setting that is intended here. And as readers, we are set up to kind of look at Lore's powers in relation to her mysterious past. So none of it is really built out in a really complex way at the beginning. And so she is captured by these guards, and she is taken to what is basically the church of this world. I mean, not basically, it is a church, but just kind of conceptualizing of how religion functions in this world, which in a lot of ways honestly kind of typically mirrors what we think about in religion in fantasy novels, or especially kind of just remixing how Christianity functioned in society in different historical periods. And this very much has a feeling of Versailles to it, because we are moving into a really lush and extravagant palace situation. But first, we are introduced to the church, and we as readers are kind of primed through Lore's point of view, because it is third person, but we are primarily seeing things through Lore's point of view, to not necessarily trust the head of the church. He is brother to the king, and so there really is this kind of expectation of both a consolidation of power, but also that potential for there to be a rivalry there in terms of the power. And so she is introduced to not only the head of the church here, but also some of this kind of elite guard, including Gabriel. And so she is then taken to the king, where it is basically explained that she is expected to spy on his son Bastion, who he thinks is betraying them to a neighboring country because villages have been wiped out overnight through this kind of death magic. And so they know of her power based on this horse. They don't know of her super secret history, but they also know that she is a spy, and they potentially think she's a good spy. There is this expectation at the beginning of the book where it's you're such a good spy. And as you're reading, you're I don't think she's actually a good spy though. And then at least there are some lines later that are maybe she's not a great spy. Maybe we've just been telling her she's a great spy. So her spy abilities are in question for me as a reader, but nonetheless, she's put in this situation. And obviously, as readers, we're like, what's going on here? But not only is she put and basically threatened with the burning isles, I believe it's called. I'm probably completely wrong, and I apologize. The world in this, while developed, is still somewhat tenuous to me. We're very much setting up this expectation of like excess and depravity, and especially with Bastian, who she's supposed to be spying on, he's our kind of cruel prince character, and yet he doesn't feel as fully formed necessarily in terms of that excess. Always feels a little bit like just a painted backdrop and not like the fully developed world, at least to me as a reader. And we'll go into more of some of that. So she is basically told that this is going to be her job or else. But not only that, she comes to find out that Gabe will be the one kind of introducing her to this world, because she does have the valid concern where she's like, you know, people are going to have questions if I just show up. I don't really look like I fit in. So I guess in some ways she has decent spy instincts. I say as if I know anything about spying. I surely don't. But she's like, okay, how's this gonna work? And come to find out, Gabe, who again is part of this elite kind of religious group, almost kind of like a monk, because there has been a vow of celibacy, which becomes very important in some ways. Come to find out, he is actually a duke in this world, because there are dukes in this world. I believe it was a duke. And his father had basically betrayed the country to this neighboring kingdom force. He had been killed by that neighboring kingdom force in return, because they were like, well, if you betrayed your country, you can also betray us. Which honestly, as ruthless as that seems, feels like good instincts to me in terms of like loyalties. But because his father committed treason in this world, it is established, especially through like there are little intros to chapters that are basically pulled from presumably mostly the religious texts of this world, that he carries the burden of his father's sins. And so he has been told by the head of this church that by joining this group, he will be redeeming himself and his name and basically atoning for that sin. And so he has not interacted with this world, but he's being forced to interact with the world again to reintroduce himself, but introduce Lore into this world as his cousin. That becomes complicated throughout the course of the book because they are making eyes at each other. If you are like, I want a book that is full of so much sexual tension, boy, do I have good news for you. And I'm not gonna lie to you, the sexual tension of it all, and honestly, the throuple potential of it all, is what kept me engaged. I was very invested in that because that's basically the setup of the thing, right? This scenario forces Lore and Gabe together into close proximity. They are being forced to share rooms, and then they are forced into the proximity of Bastian, the prince, because they have been threatened basically on pain of death to get close to him. And we meet him at a party. They're invited to this masquerade. The first night, Bastian pretty much knows what's up. And so throughout all of this, they are basically trying to find evidence that Bastian is betraying to this foreign entity. They are kind of dodging threats from the king, especially. The palace itself is very much set up to really be a place of excess and kind of entitlement. And that's one of the main focuses of the book. Really Lore looking at the difference on the outside versus the inside, the consequences on the outside versus the inside, especially in relation to poison, because she goes inside and at this first ball, she sees people recreationally drinking poison, and knowing that there are really significant costs for people who engage in the same activities just outside the palace gates. And so there is this expectation that the narrative is setting up this excess, but again, it doesn't feel as completely drawn to me as I wanted it to. And I don't know, because there are books like House of Hunger that I think very much set a similar setting of excess and looking at the ways class exploit their privilege and take advantage of the lower classes and how that operates. And here we really seem to be exploring similar things, especially if we're looking at it in context of Versailles being a historical inspiration. We are definitely interested in exploring that disparity and the unrest that disparity causes, and our characters are very interested in that. But again, we have these like settings or these little references that seem to be building or intending to build out this world very naturally, but to me feel a little flat in the building. And that is the case, unfortunately for me, with the characters as well. At first I was really on board because, again, I really respond to sexual tension. And don't get me wrong, I'm still invested, but especially when looking at like the length of the book, I had a moment in the last third where I really started to struggle with why I was invested in the story and why I cared. And when we had such an active opening, it seemed like we were really getting to know Laura, but as time progressed, it didn't feel like we got to know her any better beyond the kind of revelation of some of these secrets that had been dangled over the course of the book. And the dangling makes sense in terms of building suspense, but I have been through these plot beats before, and I don't mean that in a bad way. There is comfort in that familiarity, in those twists and turns, how we might have slight variations on those twists and turns, especially when we add in the sexual tension of it all, and especially that sexual tension, at least to my reading, and it may just be the fan fiction talking, is kind of existing within the whole triangle. So I wasn't upset that the beats felt familiar. There is comfort in that familiarity, and there is real opportunity in that familiarity, but rather it didn't feel like it used that to its advantage to build out to that. The world building, especially in relation to the magic systems, and again, it could just be my own comprehension skills, felt like it was holding back a lot, especially at the beginning, because we were kind of playing cards close to our chest in terms of Laura's backstory. But Laura's backstory isn't really that revelatory, and that's fine. It doesn't have to be as revelatory to us as readers as it is within the world itself, but it felt like because of that, there wasn't really, at least for me, this real understanding of the magic. We were throwing out these words and these terms and building the kind of lore of the world that way. No pun intended. I don't even think that's a pun. Her name is Laura, which also, again, that kind of like not like other girl-ness of it, because it didn't allow me as a reader. I felt the stakes in terms of not wanting her to be banished to this painful, awful place, but it never really felt like she was active in things, and I understand resisting this mission or resisting whatever, and there were moments of action, don't get me wrong, when she felt the consequences of this magic, and I felt like one of the best bits of her kind of backstory that was built out was a friendship she had early on and kind of a bad interaction in that friendship that led to some regret in terms of her magical powers and how that lingers, and so I found that really interesting. But because so much of her is unknown, I think so much is even unknown to herself, that we're really kind of forced to discover her through mainly these relationships, and she is a lot pluckier, and she's fighting for the common kind of perspective, and she finds an unexpected ally in Bastion in terms of fighting for that common perspective. But we really are kind of looking at the archetypes of these characters in many ways at times, and it may just be that this book is establishing them, because again, I was having fun, I was invested, and so I think what this may circle back to is that the book was potentially just a little too long, and it reads really quickly, don't get me wrong, the font is pretty big, but I think there was an opportunity for tightening potentially, and I think it wants to live in that in-between because it doesn't want to be young adult fantasy, because it's not, and so it wants to build out that world, and we were building out places with a lot of these kind of side quests almost, and also the dynamic between these three characters, Gabe, Laura, and Bastion. And in terms of that, we've got Laura kind of coming in as this charismatic outsider that's like bringing in this attention and capturing the attention of both Bastion and Gabe. Gabe a little bit more through forced proximity, admittedly, and then Bastion, who almost too easily seems to be anticipating a lot of the movements on Laura and Gabe's side. So it is this potential that he's paying a lot of attention to them. It is this potential that they are admittedly not as smart as they think they are. There's a lot going on there, but we are throwing these three characters together a lot, and we are having to navigate potential backstories in terms of Gabe and Bastion, Bastian, getting to know each other in terms of Gabe and Lore, the way that allegiances are changing based on closeness, especially in terms of Gabe, the way his kind of worldview is being shaken in a lot of ways, and the way that Lore and Bastian are kind of united in their worldview and how it's in opposition to Gabe, and just the way that a lot of the dynamics are changing in the group. So to appreciate the change, we have to establish the before, but sometimes, unfortunately, again, the characters end up feeling flatter than I would like, and I just think that that becomes more obvious in the narrative when it's kind of dragging on. And again, I kind of understand the instinct for the length and all of the scenes, but sometimes it's just a little bit too much. I stopped caring a little bit toward the end because I had felt where we were going and I enjoyed the ride. I wanted to go on that ride, but I realized we weren't going to get some payoff on some things in this book, and I just was ready for a kind of tight ending, and we did get a tight ending. And there is a really fun twist at the end that, while not unexpected necessarily, like I didn't have this oh shit moment, it made sense to me. It does promise more pining and tension in the second book, and I think that there is a really interesting dynamic we're gonna have there, but a lot of the twists throughout the book felt like they should be bigger revelations to me as a reader than they ended up feeling like. And I don't need everything to feel like this huge kind of earth-shattering revelation, but I want it to really impact the characters more than I could get a sense of things impacting them. And I don't know if it was that point of view, if it was a little bit the length, if it was not having a complete sense of the world and exactly what was at stake for all of these characters. I understood the stakes intellectually, but I didn't necessarily always feel them, if that makes sense. And I think that that is somewhat the case with some of this. I don't know if part of that is the flatness at times of these characters, at least to my reading. And I don't mean to say that I didn't enjoy it or I wasn't engaged by any means, but I did struggle at times, and I did have these moments of wondering whether Lore was kind of veering into not like other girls syndrome. So I'm very interested in seeing where this is going to go. Another thing that was really interesting to kind of look at was the language used in the book, because we are very much, like I said, in this pseudo-historical setting. It feels familiar, even if it is new in terms of the setting. And yet the language was very much modern vernacular in a lot of times in ways that could be potentially jarring. But at the same time, I think that that more modern vernacular, which was absolutely an intentional choice, allowed the narrative to read a little quicker. So even with the length, it helped move things along. It helped our brains keep up because we were reading things in a way that our kind of conception of language is a little bit more primed to process quicker, right? It also kind of helped connect us to the characters in that way as well. It helped the reactions feel a little bit more grounded in some ways at certain times. I don't know, maybe that's a stretch, but it was an interesting choice. And I think that choice could kind of be extrapolated out to kind of look at excess in the current moment, in the modern day, in our real world, and kind of transposing, or kind of just like putting a clear film over this world in comparison with ours. I don't know. I'm thinking of like the overhead projector sheets that at least I had in school where you could just write on top of them. Why? I don't know. I also want to say I'm sure I've read and enjoyed and probably raved about other books that may have similar issues that I responded to really well. And so that's why I'm going back to the length and the styles of different things potentially to kind of dig into to see why I maybe am not responding as well as I would in other circumstances here. Like when I talk about things like The Cruel Prince and Serpent and Dove, which I responded well to. Not everyone did to those books either, but I enjoyed them. And so why am I having trouble with similar things being transposed here? Because again, I don't think whether you want to call it a trope or whatever, but just like those forms being used in and of itself is not the problem, because I know I respond well to them. So what is it about here that I didn't respond to as well as I wanted to is what I'm trying to kind of break down. Again, that doesn't mean that I didn't enjoy it, just that there was more potential. So this book is a really interesting kind of mix because it's definitely fantasy. It definitely has leanings towards romance. And I think that there's a really interesting moment we're having with romance in fantasy and a lot of romance readers leaning towards romantasy. Is that what they're calling it? Is that what we're calling it? I don't know. I haven't fully jumped into a lot of the really big titles in that genre. But this book is very romance forward, or at least shipping forward, but I wouldn't categorize it as romantic fantasy, romantasy in whatever way, because the payoff of that isn't in this book itself. We may get some kisses, we definitely get the sexual tension, but we are building a kind of larger romantic plotting in it. And I will say, for me personally, I was much more invested in these characters, their potential romantic entanglings, where they were going to end up, than the larger world consequences. And yes, in theory, we're supposed to care about our characters in whatever way. That doesn't mean we necessarily have to like them, but we need to be intrigued by them or interested in them in whatever way. So that makes sense. But I definitely felt like that was the focus for me as a reader in terms of what I was interested in and what I was reading for. I was interested in how the twists and turns were going to impact the potential romantic entanglements of these characters. That may just be my own reading experience. That may just be me projecting what I'm interested in on the book, but I also feel like I was being given the fodder to be completely invested in that. So based on this discussion, you may think I hated this book. I didn't. I just had moments of disappointment where I realized it wasn't necessarily going to be the knock it out of the park 5-star read that at the beginning of the book I anticipated it could be, especially with all of that delicious sexual tension. So I'm interested to see where the story arc goes. I just think that there was potentially opportunities to tighten in a way that helped build out the characters more, build out the world more, and really keep things pushing. But I also understand the need to kind of live in the world a little bit, explore the world a little bit for this kind of larger arc and making the movements and the changes in the characters read more significantly as things change. If you've read the book, I guess now is the time where you tell me if my thoughts are unpopular here, but let me know what you're thinking. Like, subscribe as you see fit. Thanks for hanging out and listening to my thoughts as always. Read something good, and yeah, bye.